very warm welcome to everyone, to all our parents, our teachers, our students, and friends and family, and everyone who are joining us today. And a very warm welcome to Mr. Kapil Sibal, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. And as we all know, Mr. Sibal is a seasoned lawyer and politician. He is a former minister of various ministries like the Science and Technology Department, Human Resource Department, Law and Justice, and Communications and IT. He has also served as Additional Solicitor General of India and President of the Supreme Court Bar Associations on 3 occasions. Mr. Sibal also happens to be an alumni of various prestigious institutions around the world, like St. Stephen's College and Harvard University. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us, sir, today. And I'm sure everyone's really excited to hear your viewpoint on how to make sense of this ongoing crisis. What do we do? So, sir, my first question really is that the Prime Minister just announced this humongous relief fund with a mind-boggling number of zeros attached to it, with nothing addressed to the educational industry. In fact, on the flip side, a lot of states are telling us, don't charge fees, waive off fees. And as you know, education institutions are well-oiled machines. We need funds to pay salaries to run. Do you think this is the correct way for the government to react? And how are we expected to survive in the current scenario without the government's help?
Well, okay, let's put it this way. We are in the midst of a national crisis. Right. And in this national crisis, each of us, I think, whether they are institutions or individuals, have to play a role. We need to sacrifice a bit ourselves for the larger public good. So I think to the extent that the government wants each of us to sacrifice, I think to that extent the government is right. The issue may well be the priorities of the government. You may say that, look, in terms of their priorities, education is one sector that needs some kind of help from the government, because education perhaps touches every home in this country, and especially in a country where the student community is young, and therefore both institutions and students should be given some kind of a rihat, as they say, some kind of help. It is true that of the announcements made by the finance minister as well as the prime minister, there is no reference to educational institutions. But I think it's like this: if you've taken loans at institutions from banks, you can certainly approach the banks that in this moment of national crisis, the interest payments that we are required to make and the term loans that we are required to honor, you may delay them and defer them over a period of time. And I'm sure that if you approach the banks may well agree. So I think that's one thing that you can do as an institution. And as far as students are concerned, yes, students belong to various, I would say, strata of society. And when they apply to you, you also obviously ask them what is their parents' income, right? And I think you can sort that out by looking at their applications, the data that they have provided to you. Those who come up from families which are prosperous, where the annual income is sufficiently high, I think you need not give any help to them. For those who belong to the poorer sections of society, and you are required to make admissions also on the basis of that, I think you can say that we, for a moment, defer your fees or waive your fees. That's something that you have to decide upon. I think this is the way to look at it.
Right. Sir, as you know that the education industry itself in India and around the world is facing huge disruption at the moment. What do you think the future of education is going to look like? Is there going to be more and more online classes happening for the next couple of years, or is it now the new way of the future? Is this how?
Well, I think that when we look at education, especially institutions of your nature, you look at it somewhat myopically, because you belong to the privileged classes, and the institution that you run is really an institution for the privileged. It's like the Prime Minister telling us that, telling the nation that you must now honor social distancing, little knowing that 50% of India can't honor it. Mm-hmm. And if you look at Delhi How will you effect social distancing amongst bastis in Delhi? And 50% of our population lives in jhoparis, jhuggi jhoparis. So I think as a nation, we who are the privileged always look at ourselves rather than at others, and don't look at the problems of others. Important to realize, you talk about connectivity and conferencing. This is a privileged class of people who can afford it. But there are around, 70, 80% who cannot afford it in this country. Forget about video conferencing, but forget about connectivity. Many schools, for example, have one teacher to a class of 90, right? Now, in order to make sure that IT can perform and education can be delivered through IT, we need a fiber optic network in India. And the fiber optic network should connect every Gram Panchayat and in turn do a last mile connection to every institution in this country, right? That fiber optic network, which we started, which in fact I started, was to be completed, immediately after 2014. And we're in 2020. And this government is far from even connecting the Gram Panchayats in this country. 250,000 Gram Panchayats were to be connected, and I don't think we've connected even 100,000. So that's where we are. So when you look at this issue, don't look at education through your eyes. Look at education because there are different layers of people who are recipients of education, and they have different needs. As far as you are concerned, yes, you can use information technology for the purposes of education. There's no doubt about it.
So what I wanted to know was how can the government help not just us, but what kind of policy should the government be making across all strata of society for education at the moment?
I told you, the policy is first you lay down the fiber optic network. How do you have a policy without the infrastructure? For example, how do you drive on a highway unless you make the highway? Right? So you're asking me, you can have a policy for the speed limit on a highway, right? But that can only happen, that policy can only happen if there's a highway.
You're absolutely right, sir. I mean, even in terms of teaching, there's a lot of challenges to online education. A lot of teachers don't own laptops. Or if they own laptops, they don't know how to conduct classes online, or they don't have an internet broadband connection. So it's not just, it's actually challenges for all stratas of society. Even a lot of our teachers have never used this kind of technology before, because we are still in that era where teachers are used to boards and chalks. So
they're not familiar with the computer.
Exactly.
They don't know how to handle a computer. So by the time you start a class, if a class is 45 minutes, you take 15 minutes to actually connect, right? And by the time something goes wrong in between, then of course it'll take another 15 minutes to connect. And then of course sometimes the voice fails, sometimes this happens, that happens, bandwidth is not there. So all kinds of problems. So unless, as I said, the key issue is infrastructure, and this government has done nothing about it.
So how do you think the current scenario is going to impact first-hand experience for students? The courts have been closed for 2 months.
Okay, let me, sorry to interrupt. There's another issue that I want to point in of I want to to remember when I was Minister of Human Resource Development, I launched a project called Akash.
Yes, sir.
Akash was a tablet that I wanted every student in this country to have in his or her hand. What was the vision behind it? I knew that down the road, this country will need to have a highway for education. And if that highway is built, and if we can provide an Akash tablet for every student, then in fact, a teacher in Delhi, a good teacher in Delhi or in Mumbai can teach the subject which he is best at to students across the country. Right? That was my vision. And I remember having gone to UNESCO, and in the course of my intervention in UNESCO, I said that we need to change the definition of literacy. You see, and I said illiteracy should be part of the definition of literacy. This is what I said, I think, way back in 2009.
Right.
And these people never took it forward, and
Right.
11 years down the road, we are now being confronted with problems that we cannot solve.
Absolutely, sir. I mean, if this issue was addressed then, today I think we would have been a lot better prepared for this kind of a crisis
Right.
across institutions. So, as I was asking, sir, how do you think this will impact first-hand experience? Like, say, kids used to get, students used to gather in-depth knowledge via internships or via first-hand experience in courts. Now, courts being closed for 2 months, or even students who are studying to be doctors, how will first-hand experience be gathered, do you think?
Yeah, that's another very important. It's more important for medicine than it is for law.
Right.
Because in medicine you have to have practical knowledge as to how to deal with people and how to deal with patients.
Right.
And I think unless you have that knowledge and that clinical knowledge, you'll not be able to be a consummate doctor. When it comes to law, that's not so important, but certainly it is important. You have to have a feel for the profession. And you never get a feel from the profession through video conferencing and through Zoom.
Right.
So I think that what's important here is for, and of course the system is not really functional at the moment. We're all sort of experimenting. Many of us don't know how to use a computer. And remember, you're talking to a Supreme Court lawyer, and but to talk to district court lawyers, not just in Delhi. Delhi is still, of course, far more advanced. But talk of district court lawyers in remote courts in India, in tehsils. What do they know about computers? They know very little. And where's the connectivity? And how will court procedures go on there? And even if you use video conferencing, I can understand that. That can be used in very few matters. Because you need when in court, the expression of the judge, you can put in your arguments far more forcefully. So I think that this is limiting. Video conferencing is empowerment on the one hand, an extremely limiting factor on another hand. So you should build on the empowerment and reduce the limiting factor. So therefore should be a combination of video conferencing and appearances in court. And I think after a while, we'll strike a balance between the two. And that's how we move forward.
So do you think the future will be e-courts if this situation doesn't get sorted out? Do you think that might be the future?
I don't think so. Solve issues, complex needs. It's a bit.
So I think there's some connectivity issue. I can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Why?
Now I can hear you, sir. I think there was
Must be.
connectivity issue.
Must be.
So what position do you think India should take in global politics at the moment between America and China? What should be India's position?
You must understand India's geopolitical situation. We are a part of Asia, right? And if you look at the population of the world, with 1.3 billion people in India and another 1.45 billion people in China, right? Of the 6 odd billion people, we represent 1/3 of the world, more than 1/3 of the world, right? So for every 6 people, there'll be 2, either Indians or Chinese. So therefore, the momentum for economic activity lies in this part of the world. That's one part which we must understand. So there'll be a lot of interest in American, in the West, from the Western world to be allowed to invest in India, to invest in India. So that's the momentum. At the moment, there is a huge problem going on between the United States and China. And in fact, America is going through a period of negative growth. And interests being given in America at negative rates of interest. Loans that are being given in America are at negative rates of interest. China seems to have stabilized after the crisis. And China seems to be in a position to export to the rest of the world. There is, of course, a momentum in Europe as well as in the United States to make sure that the factories which produce goods and services move out of China to the extent that it's possible. Mm-hmm. But a recent survey was made wherein those who had invested in China and those who were manufacturing in China, when they were asked, do they intend to move out of China? The answer was no. About more than 60% said no. Despite this crisis, they will not move out of China. Mm-hmm. So the reality is that China is a powerhouse. Mm-hmm. We cannot put in place policies that in fact do not build on an Indo-Chinese relationship. Mm-hmm. Right?
Right.
Number two, United States is far away from us. And Donald Trump has been following insular policies. Donald Trump, in his statement that make in America, like Modi ji's statement of make in India, mm-hmm. He wants all factories to shift back to America, right. to bring manufacturing back to America, mm-hmm. right? And so that's the other momentum that's happening. Mm-hmm. And if you notice in this entire process, the only companies that are making a profit and the only companies that are whose stocks have gone up are those companies who are providing platforms for services in India, mm-hmm. right? Whether it's right. Amazon or it's some other companies. Mm-hmm. The rest of the country and the economic activity in India has become paralyzed. Only these companies are making a profit, mm-hmm. right? And who are these companies? American companies, mm-hmm. right? So in fact, this crisis has opened up opportunities for American conglomerates, mm-hmm. right? And at the moment, the Chinese are not in competition. But we source a lot of our goods from China. In fact, almost 20% mm-hmm. of our imports are from China itself. Mm-hmm. So we are dependent on China. So we are in a position where we can displease neither one nor the other because we need both, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. So we can't show our eyes to China that Modi ji wanted when UPA was in power, mm-hmm. right? Nor can we be that friendly with the United States, mm-hmm. right? Because Trump will only do what is called America first. Right. For Trump, India is not first. Mm-hmm. So therefore, we are caught in the middle and we have to move very delicately and very diplomatically. And at the moment, I don't know where we stand.
So we have a lot of questions coming from the students. Somebody's asking, what would your government have done differently if you had to incentivize investments in India?
Incentivize what? Sorry?
Investments in India. What would your government would have done differently to incentivize more investments in India?
Well, we would have done many things differently, except that we are not in government. I tell you, that's a whole saga. We would have had our priorities right. I think these people have their priorities wrong. You know, just remember this. I mean, let's look. First of all, we would have had a prime minister who people should have believed in. I remember when Notebandi happened, when demonetization mm-hmm. took place, our dear Prime Minister, who I respect very much, mm-hmm. made a statement that everything will be over in 50 days. Mm-hmm. And everything will be normal in 50 days. Mm-hmm. And after 50 days, if things are not normal, you call me to any choraha and mm-hmm. give me whatever punishment we want. So we are looking for that choraha, and he has not come there till date, right? Recently, when this crisis happened, he made a public statement through television mm-hmm. that after 21 days, everything will be normal. Just give 21 days. Mm-hmm. So 21 days and passed. We are in lockdown 3.0. We're going to, tomorrow I think is going to be lockdown 4.0, right? So first we would have made sure that that the public of India believes in our Prime Minister, mm-hmm. right? That our Prime Minister does what he says, that there will never be a statement from a Prime Minister which will not be accurate, right? Mm-hmm. and that it would not be a two-man centric government.
Right.
That policies will be at the forefront, individuals will be not at the forefront.
Mm-hmm.
We would have made sure, you're talking about investments. Investments will only happen when there is institutional assurance,
Mm-hmm.
right? That institutions work independently. If banks work independently,
Mm-hmm.
if states are allowed to work independently, if governments are not destabilized,
Mm-hmm.
if you are other, like the judiciary, the Reserve Bank of India, the universities like yours, that they are given the kind of independence that generates knowledge.
Right.
Remember, and I'll give you one example.
Mm-hmm.
I believe, and I'm sure that you will agree with me, that the wealth of a nation depends on the generation of knowledge.
Absolutely.
The wealth of a nation does not depend on the volumes that you produce and the volumes that you sell. It depends on the volumes that you create through knowledge, volume of ideas. That can only happen in the university system. And that can only happen if you give independence to the university system.
Right.
Allow universities to grow in accordance with their vision, right? And it's only then that wealth can be created. And when wealth is created, investments will take place. You have what is called startups in this country.
Right.
What is a startup? A startup it happens on the basis of a new idea, a new vision, a new kind of technology. That's based on knowledge. That's where investment comes. So the answer to the question is, we would have put in policies in place where what we do in India would have attracted investments from abroad.
Right.
Right? And that would have applied to different sectors of the economy. They have destroyed the leather sector completely. They have completely destroyed the leather sector. Look what they have done to the textile sector. And the fact that other jurisdictions don't have confidence in India is that when factories are moving from China, they're not coming to India. They're going to either Vietnam or to Bangladesh. So obviously our policies, our investment policies are not in place. And we would have certainly done things differently.
Right. So another student wants to know, how do you think we should implement lockdown 4.0 now that it's impending? And as compared to strategies being followed by Europe and US? If you were in charge, how would lockdown 4.0 be implemented?
Of course, that's a pipe dream if I was in charge. I don't believe in pipe dreams, but be that as it may, I will try and answer the question.
Okay.
It's like this. You see, we are not fully understanding the concept of lives versus livelihoods. Right? There is no life without livelihood. Right? And there is no livelihood without life.
Right.
Okay? So we need to protect both.
Right.
Right. Now, how did other countries protect both? Take Germany. Germany, 80% of all factories in Germany were working during lockdown. They did not stop their economy.
Right.
What did Stockholm do? What did Sweden do? Sweden said, we leave it to the public.
Right.
Right? They will decide. They must be careful. We will protect the elderly. But as far as the rest of the public is concerned, there will be no lockdown, but we will request people to be very careful about what they do and how they move, so that they should wear masks, right? So each country, depending on the demographics and the situation in that country, decided how to deal with the pandemic, right? But there is no country in the world that had a complete lockdown like India. There is no country in the world. So I would like to know, what was the rationale of paralyzing the entire economy? There was no rationale. And you made the announcement on March 24 of this year and gave 4 hours to people, only 4 hours to people, after which the lockdown was implemented. And we have, because of this knee-jerk decision, a crisis in India, which we call the migrant crisis.
Right.
And we are not being able to solve. Just today, 24 people died. 24 people died. Migrants died in a road accident because there are no vehicles on the road, so people are driving rashly, and the result is 24 people died. 16 people the other day were run over on a railway track when they walk hundreds of miles, rested on a track thinking there would be no train running there. Now, this is all the result of that knee-jerk decision. So if I were in charge, I would first have moved these migrants out of their places of work. Remember, if you look at the number of people who have been affected and who have been infected, most of them are from towns, cities, where planes land, because this pandemic has been imported from outside. It's not an indigenous pandemic.
Right.
So it has not touched rural India, which is why the numbers are small at the moment. Because there are no airports in rural India, there is no connectivity in rural India, people don't move in large numbers into rural India. So we should have allowed the migrants to move first, allowed the rural districts to continue with their economic activity, and then ensured that only in hot zones, the red zones, and maybe partially in the orange zones, you have a partial lockdown. You can't destroy livelihoods because that way you will destroy lives. And in order to save lives, you must continue to ensure that there is livelihood. And this is where this government made a mistake.
Great. Sir, you have been you were a member of the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative and the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation's Indian AIDS Initiative as well. What is your opinion on the timeline as regards to the vaccine? When do you think there'll be a viable vaccine? And will the vaccine even be viable with the rapidly mutating virus?
Well, let me put, of course, there are several kinds of viruses. Those that have come from Europe are one kind. Those that have come from the US are another kind. But let's leave that out for a moment, because if they mutate, I think that you can have a vaccine which can deal with each of these viruses. That's not an issue. But I think in terms of timelines, I don't think that you will have an effective vaccine which can be administered at your doorstep, right? Before 1 to 1.5 years. It's just not possible. Even if you have a vaccine, you have to rev up the manufacturing capacity, and there has to be a global supply because this is a global pandemic. Everyone must have it.
Right.
For doing that, it's very difficult to provide that at every doorstep, at every household before 1.5 years.
Wow, so that's a really long timeline. And how are we expected to open institutions if there's no viable vaccine out? Do you think
that's a problem? How are the airlines expected to fly? You're talking about institutions. How are airlines expected to fly? And if air travel goes, then your hotels go. Hotels go, your restaurant business goes, right? Your tourism goes. So I think we'll have to think of, some interim measures to be able to deal with these sectors of the economy, including educational institutions. But
I think it's particularly hard for education institutions because a student can't afford to lose a year or 6 months of an education.
That's why I suggested, when this question was asked of me recently, I said there should be no class 10 boards. There's no need for a class 10 board. This is an emergency. You should promote children, either promote all of them to the next class and have extra classes, or you do an internal assessment if you are confident about that. And the students who have done well in the internal assessment can actually be promoted. And I think that as far as class 12 exams are concerned, they have to be held. We have no choice on the matter.
Right.
Class 12 exams have to be held. But the problem is that class 12 exams in the kind of architecture that has been put in place may impact the poor much more.
Right.
And that would be unfortunate.
So a student wants to ask, what in your opinion should be the lessons that we as a nation learn from this crisis?
Well, I think that's a lesson we should have learned long ago. Not just the nation, but the world.
Right.
And what's the lesson we need to learn? That look, we are part of this ecosystem. We are beneficiaries of this ecosystem, which we call the universe. Right? And as we are beneficiaries of all the bounties of this planet, right? We somehow have got the impression that this planet is for us. It is not for anybody else, right? Just as we are selfish in our relationships with others, because we think of our lives from our point of view, never from the other person's point of view. That is true of the character of human beings that has developed over the years, especially in a consumer-oriented world. We always think of ourselves, but we must always remember that when we think only of ourselves, we harm somebody else, right? And in this planet, we've only thought of Homo sapiens. We're not thought of all the others who are also as much beneficiaries of the ecosystem as we are, and that we must share the planet with all of them. And the reason for this pandemic is that attitude that we have never protected the planet, which is why we have global warming, which is why we have viruses coming around, right? And this will hit us again and again. So we are sowing the seeds of our own destruction. Right. The lesson we must learn is that exploiting the planet for our own comfort, because we need to have air conditioning, we need to have the right kind of temperature in our room, we need all the goodies that we want, right at our doorstep, right? We are moving away from manual labor, we're moving away from nature. If we continue to do that, nature will take its revenge. And this pandemic is one attack by nature to revenge and to avenge the manner in which we've treated it.
Very true. Very true, sir. So how do you compare this to the Great Depression or the 2008 economic crisis? Do you think it's possible to estimate how long the recovery would take?
I think this crisis is much worse than the recession. Because the recession was caused by wars. And there were economic factors that resulted in the recession. This recession affects each one of us around the world, poor, rich, everybody. Right? And all economic activity globally has stopped. So it's much worse, right? And you had the recession of 2000, you had the crisis of 2008, for example. That was a financial crisis again. The subprime crisis was a financial crisis again. Right? And so that could be fixed. Right. But this is not a financial crisis. It can only be fixed through a vaccine. And in between, we can't do anything about it. So the recession is going to be much deeper and much worse.
And how long do you think a recovery would take? How long would it be before we bounce back?
Well, it all depends. And I think that it's going to take a long time. I mean, I really cannot predict how long it will take, but it'll take a long time because, see, the problem is the following. See, it has a rolling effect in the sense that one activity, affects the other. So if the employer doesn't have income, he can't pay the worker. If the worker doesn't have income, he can't buy anything. If you can't buy anything, then the factory will not produce. Because they can only produce to sell. Right. If the factory does not produce, it cannot employ people. So if it cannot employ people, it will not ask for raw material. Right. If it doesn't ask for raw material, there'll be no supplies. So it affects every aspect of economic activity. Right? And that's difficult. I mean, how the cycle will turn around, I don't know. But it's tough.
So, sir, what you're saying is it's a natural disease, not a man-made disease? Is that what you're saying? Do you agree? There's so many conspiracy theories flowing around that it's a man-made disaster. It's a man-made pandemic.
See, I don't think we should get into that because I think we should get into that after we recover.
Right.
Right. So first thing, when you are on a ventilator or you're in the ICU, your first priority should be to make sure that you recover. After you fully recover, then you do the diagnosis.
Right.
As
Mhm.
to why did it reach the ICU,
Mhm.
right? So you're asking me to do a diagnosis without recovery. I think I'll wait for the recovery. The world should recover before we do a diagnosis.
Right. Right. So how should students be spending, somebody wants to know, their time productively during this lockdown? Do you recommend any books one should read? What would be your top 3 recommendations be
You
for
know, there are
students?
many, and it's not, it's like, you see, today, for those of you who have access to an iPad or a mobile phone, you can access the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You can access the world for your information.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it depends on what your interests are, right? So some people like me who are fond of cooking, right? You know, this is spare time to start cooking something for my wife. Otherwise, the rest of the year she cooks for me. So I can recommend some good cookbooks. there's a very wonderful book. There's a wonderful cookbook called Dushum, right? And it's
Okay, right.
available
I've
at
heard of
Bari.
that. Yeah.
You've heard of that? It's
Yes.
available at Bari Sons, yeah.
Right.
Right. So those young girls interested in cooking should buy Dushum.
Okay.
Okay. Some people may be interested in other things. And, you know, if you're interested in politics, there are lots of wonderful books to read. If you're interested in economics, there are other books to read.
So anything you recommend to our students that they should be um, read, especially to our law students? Any
Well,
book?
for those who are interested in saving the world, they should read Sapiens.
I love that book. So in fact, when you were talking about how we are so selfish, it reminded me of Sapiens, what Yuval Noah Harari said as well.
That's right.
It resonated with me.
Yeah.
So we've been hearing a lot in the news about, in America as well as India, about how a lot of jail inmates are being released on compassionate grounds.
Right.
Because they feel like overcrowding is leading to more spread of disease.
Right.
How is that something that's common and a practical thing to do? How do you think that will impact the society in general?
So I think there are lots of poor people, and this is a very interesting question that you have asked. If you really look at the people in jails who are being prosecuted for offenses and who can't get bail, most of them are very poor people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and if you really go into the dynamics of the demographics of those who are in jail, you will find that a lot of them are either Muslims belonging to very poor sections of society,
Mm-hmm.
or scheduled castes, right? Scheduled castes, or the poorest of the poor,
Right.
right? And they don't have the economic wherewithal to get hold of a good lawyer,
Mm-hmm.
right? Many of them can't get bail. So I think there should be a policy in this to give temporary relief to those who are not charged with any serious offenses.
Mm-hmm.
You know, maybe stealing, you know, a few hundred rupees and stuff like that. Many of them are not on bail. So I think that a policy of the government should be framed by which the poorest of the poor have no means, unless they are involved in murder and some things like that, should be released on bail, temporarily at least.
Mm-hmm.
As it is, the jails are overcrowded. And if really the pandemic spreads to those jails, it'll be a situation difficult to handle.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of professions, somebody's asking, a lot of professions are going to become redundant in the next 5 years. So today, if a student is at a precipice of choosing a career, what would you recommend are the options which are viable and important for the next 5 to 10 years? Say you are at the precipice.
It is said that lawyers are the perennial parasites. Why are the perennial parasites? When the economy is down, you need a lawyer.
Right.
When the economy is up, you need a lawyer. Right? So those of you who want to be perennial parasites, join the legal profession. Right? This is only in a lighter way. Doctors, the medical profession. Right. There's going to be a huge expansion in the medical profession. I think health sector is going to be given enormous importance in the years to come, right? Health facilities will be built, even in remote areas in India, right? There will be there will be demand for medical professionals, right? So I think that's another profession to embrace. Then information technology, education, right? The telecommunications sector, right? Startups, new ideas, the service sector by and large. But I don't think that professionals will become redundant. I don't agree with that perception. What will happen is that professionals and disciplines will reorient themselves to deliver the same services. For example, I give you an example. If I want to go to a museum, right? Now I can, on my iPad and on my mobile phone, be connected to the museum. So instead of actually physically going to a particular museum, I can actually walk through it. Right? So there will be then lessons given on when we walk through a museum. As wherever we go in some museum, they provide you earphones and stuff like that, right? So that kind of industry will develop. I'm just giving an example. So tourism will have a new flavor. The nature of tourism may well be different.
So what you're saying is that everyone will adapt.
The Taj Mahal, you don't have to go there, but you will be charged an entry fee from taking you through the Taj Mahal.
So what you're essentially saying is that everything is just going to move online. All industries, we're going to be doing.
Not everything will move online, but there will be multiple ways of enjoying our planet.
Right. Okay.
Right.
So somebody wants to know, it's a law question, with all the changes going around or being proposed in labor laws and taxation, how can businesses prepare themselves? Should they consider implementing such changes on a long-term scale?
Well, first of all, I think it was extremely insensitive of this government, of state governments, not this government, of state governments. For example, Uttar Pradesh has, abrogated 35 labor laws that were applicable at a time when the pandemic is on, when labor in any case is not getting anything, right? To do it at this stage. And incidentally, in Uttar Pradesh, even the Minimum Wages Act has been done away with. Right? Which is not so in some other states.
Right.
Now, look at the mindset of a government which does away with the Minimum Wages Act. Right? Now, they say if a worker can work from 8 to 12 hours now. Previously, you could only work 8 hours. Now, you could work 12 hours, but you will not be given any overtime. So the unit of pay for the 8 hours will be the same unit of pay for the 12 hours. But that's unfair. What about workers' safety? What about house rent allowances? What about clothing allowance? These people already are living on the margins, right? And 93% of our entire workforce is not organized. It's in the unorganized sector.
Right.
And if you destroy whatever little benefits are being given even to the organized sector, you're hurting poor people. Right? You can give tax rebates to industries. You can say set up an industry in the economic zone, right? And the tax rate will be 15%. Right? So lakhs and lakhs of crores can be given to industry. But when a poor man asks for his due because he's doing labor for you, you say, I won't even give you the minimum wage. This is absurd. Right? So now, anyway, there are four labor codes that are coming, which the government, wants to introduce and pass in Parliament. When that comes in Parliament, we'll debate it. But I think it's a very inappropriate time. I can understand if you say, okay, you can work 12 hours, but you will get overtime. Right? And all your other welfare measures are protected. But you can't abolish 35 labor laws.
Right. Sir, there's a word that's being thrown around a lot these days. What is force majeure for the layman? And do you consider this event to be an example of that?
Yes, of course it is. Of course it is. Force majeure is when through a calamity, a natural calamity, right?
Like a black swan event.
Yeah, that a contract cannot be performed. Right? So that's what force majeure is. When two people enter into a contract, and because of things which are not in the control of either of them, right?
Mhm.
And actually, when negotiating contracts, you define what force measure under the contract,
Mhm.
right? And normally, a natural calamity will be always included. It's
Right.
an earthquake that takes place, an
Mhm.
earthquake that takes place, and you have to supply goods. How do you supply goods when the earthquake has happened,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So things like that.
Right. So this event is and how does that complicate contracts today when there's so much
It
ambiguity?
will complicate, but government has to take policy decisions. Of course, people also use this situation to take advantage.
Right.
People say, all right, for example, I am living in a house and I have to pay my rent. Now,
Right.
I can't possibly take the position force measure. There is force measure,
Right.
but I have enough resources.
Mhm.
So people have
Mhm.
they are not willing to pay using this as force measure. And I think government will have to take a policy decision. But government has already said that people need not pay rent. But you take, for example, an elderly couple, right, whose only source of income is rent, and you tell the tenant not to pay the rent, what happens to the couple?
Right.
So these are very complicated issues.
Right. So we have another law-related question.
Last question, I hope.
Second last question, sir. Is that
Okay.
okay? Okay.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
should the government put on hold the provisions of IBC, specifically sections 7, 9, and 10? And on the one
Yes.
side are the interests of companies reeling under the crisis, and on the other hand, one risks dropping of India's rank in ease of doing business.
No, I don't think any rank will be dropped. That's not possible at all.
Okay.
Because the takeover of companies at this point in time, people neither have the capital
Mm-hmm.
and the price. The taking over at this stage
Mm-hmm.
would not. The whole purpose of the IBC is for the financial institutions to recover the money
Mm-hmm.
that they owed to the unit,
Mm-hmm.
right? That they owed to the business,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if at this point in time you allow a takeover, whatever little they could otherwise have recovered, they'll not be able to recover. So the whole purpose of the IBC would be lost.
Right.
But there are two views to this as well.
Mm-hmm.
Some people say, why not?
Mm-hmm. So, hello? So, can you hear me? Hello?
I said, some people say, why not? Yeah,
Right.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Hello?
Yeah.
Some
Yeah.
people say, why not?
Okay. So last question, it's really not a question, but what advice do you have for our teachers and students in general at large?
I said, this
And
is a
what should they be doing to keep their spirits up at this
look,
moment?
look, look, look. You see, in a world which has become consumption oriented, which has alienated us from each other, this is a wonderful time to get back to your families. It's a wonderful time to connect with your parents. It's a wonderful time to interact with your brothers and sisters. It's a wonderful time to reflect where you are, what you've been doing, and what you should be doing in the years to come. It's a wonderful time to introspect on what you've done wrong. It's a wonderful time to start thinking of what you should do right in the years to come.
That's great, sir. Thank you so much, sir. That was such a wonderful message. And it was so interesting to talk to you. It was so interesting to have all these questions answered, which kept coming in. Thank you so much for joining us, sir.
Thank
This was
you.
indeed a
Thank
delight.
you very much. Bye-bye.
All the best, sir. Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It was great having Mr. Sibal with us. And thank you for joining.